The underground garage of the Corinthian hotel smelled like expensive leather and motor oil, a combination that had become as familiar to Maya as her own breath. She moved between the rows of luxury vehicles with practiced efficiency, her sneakers silent against the polished concrete, her movements economical and precise. The laminated name tag clipped to her black vest read, Maya Chen, Valet Services. But most of the hotel's wealthy patrons never bothered to read it. To them, she was invisible. Just another pair of hands to retrieve their vehicles, accept their keys, and disappear back into the shadows of the parking structure. She preferred it that way. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sterile glow, washing out colors and creating deep pockets of shadow between the support columns. Maya had been working the overnight shift for 3 months now, ever since she'd fled Chicago with nothing but a duffel bag and her 8-year-old daughter asleep in the back seat of her 15-year-old Honda. The Corinthian was the kind of place where people came to be discreet, where cash tips were generous and questions were scarce. The night manager, a woman named Rita with tired eyes and a knowing smile, hadn't asked for references. She'd looked at Maya's application, noticed the question marks where previous employment should have been listed, and had simply nodded. You start tomorrow, Rita had said. Keep your head down, do your job, and we won't have any problems. Maya had kept her head down. She'd learned that skill long before she'd learned to drive a manual transmission or parallel park a Bentley in a space meant for a compact sedan. She'd learned it in her childhood home, where her father's temper had been as unpredictable as summer storms. She'd perfected it during her marriage to David, who had slowly, methodically isolated her from everyone she'd ever known, until the world had shrunk to the size of their 2-bedroom apartment, and his approval had become the oxygen she'd needed to breathe. But she wasn't thinking about David tonight. She couldn't afford to. Not when she had 4 more hours left on her shift and a stack of claim tickets waiting to be processed. The elevator dinged softly, announcing an arrival from the lobby level. Maya glanced up from the logbook where she'd been recording vehicle locations, her pen poised above the neat columns of her handwriting. Owns. A man emerged from the elevator, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never had to question his place in the world. His suit was dark, perfectly tailored, probably worth more than Maya made in 6 months. His hair was black, touched with silver at the temples, and his face was all sharp angles and shadowed planes. He wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, both built like walls, their expressions carefully neutral. Security, Maya thought, though they wore suits instead of uniforms. The kind of security that didn't advertise itself. The tall man approached the valet desk, and Maya noticed the way he carried himself. Not with the casual arrogance of wealth that she saw in most of the hotel's guests, but with something else, something harder, something that made the small hairs on the back of her neck rise in instinctive warning. She recognized that look. She'd seen it before. In different faces, different contexts. It was the look of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question, whose displeasure could have consequences that extended far beyond a poor tip or a complaint to management. Maya kept her expression carefully neutral as she met his gaze. She raised her eyebrows slightly. A question, an offer of service, and held out her hand for his claim ticket. He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable, before producing a small rectangular card from his jacket pocket. Not the standard valet ticket, Maya noticed. Something custom, heavy cardstock with embossed lettering that caught the light. She took it from him, careful not to let their fingers touch, and glanced down at the information. Black Maserati Gran Turismo, VIP section, Bay 47. Of course it was a Maserati. And of course, it was in the VIP section, where the hotel's most important guests parked their vehicles, in spaces that cost more per night than most people paid for an entire hotel room. Maya nodded once, acknowledging the request, and turned toward the key cabinet. She was reaching for the correct set when she heard one of the security men speak. She doesn't talk much, does she? The tall man didn't respond immediately. Maya could feel his gaze on her back, a weight between her shoulder blades, and she forced herself to keep her movements steady and unhurried as she located the Maserati's key fob. Maybe she just doesn't have anything to say to you, Marco. His voice was deep, cultured, with the faintest trace of an accent that Maya couldn't quite place. Italian, maybe? Or somewhere in the Mediterranean. Or maybe she's... Retrieve my car, please, the tall man said, cutting off whatever Marco had been about to suggest. It wasn't a request, despite the polite phrasing. It was a command, delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. Maya turned, the key fob in her hand, and nodded again. She walked past the three men, hyper-aware of their presence, of the way they watched her move through the garage. She'd learned to read the weight of a gaze, to distinguish between casual observation and something more predatory. These men were watching her the way security cameras watched parking lots, cataloging, recording, but without personal interest. Except for the tall man, his attention felt different, more focused, more curious. Bay 47 was on the lowest level, in a corner section reserved for the garage's most expensive vehicles. Maya took the stairs rather than the elevator, her footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. The Maserati was exactly where it should have been, gleaming under the overhead lights like a piece of automotive jewelry. Black paint, chrome details, leather interior that probably cost more than most cars in their entirety. Maya approached it carefully, running her eyes over the exterior in the habitual check she performed on every vehicle she retrieved. It was part of the job, documenting any existing damage before the car left the garage, protecting both the hotel and the valet service from liability claims. That was when she saw it. The damage was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully, but Maya had learned to notice details. She'd had to. Her survival, and Lily's survival, had depended on her ability to read situations, to notice the small things that warned of larger dangers. Someone had tampered with the Maserati's brake lines. The cut was clean, professional, positioned precisely where it would cause failure but not immediately. The kind of sabotage that would work perfectly on a highway, at speed, when the driver needed to stop and discovered that the brakes were no longer responsive. Maya's heart rate kicked up, adrenaline flooding her system with cold clarity. She crouched down, examining the damage more closely, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. This wasn't random vandalism. This was attempted murder, premeditated and calculated. And the tall man with the unreadable eyes and the security detail was about to drive this car out of the garage. For a brief moment, Maya considered her options. She could simply pretend she hadn't noticed anything. She could deliver the car, accept her tip, and let whatever was going to happen, happen. The tall man was clearly someone important, someone with power and resources and probably enemies who wanted him dead. That wasn't her problem. She'd come to San Francisco to disappear, to build a quiet life where she and Lily could be safe and anonymous. Getting involved in someone else's dangerous situation was the last thing she should do. But Maya had spent 5 years married to a man who had systematically destroyed her sense of self, who had convinced her that she was worthless, that she deserved the isolation and control he'd subjected her to. She'd spent 5 years being complicit in her own diminishment, until the night David had raised his hand to Lily, and Maya had finally found the strength to run. She couldn't watch someone drive to their death, even if warning them put her own carefully constructed invisibility at risk. Maya pulled out the small notepad she kept in her vest pocket, the one she used to communicate with guests when necessary. Her pen moved quickly across the paper, her handwriting sharp and clear despite her shaking hands. Your brake lines have been cut. Do not drive this vehicle. Someone wants you dead. She tore the page free, folded it once, and walked back up the stairs to the main level of the garage. The tall man was still waiting by the valet desk, having dismissed his security detail to positions near the elevator. He looked up as Maya approached, and something shifted in his expression. A slight narrowing of his eyes, a tension in his jaw that suggested he'd registered her empty hands and the absence of his vehicle. Maya stopped in front of him and held out the folded note. She kept her gaze steady, meeting his eyes directly despite every instinct that told her to lower her head, to make herself smaller, less noticeable, less threatening. He took the note from her, his fingers brushing against hers for just a second. His skin was warm, the contact brief but electric in a way that Maya hadn't expected. She pulled her hand back quickly, clasping both hands behind her back in a pose that was professional and unthreatening. The tall man unfolded the note and read it. His expression didn't change, but Maya saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He read the note a second time, then looked up at her. Show me, he said quietly. It wasn't what Maya had expected. She'd anticipated dismissal, perhaps anger at the delay, maybe even suspicion that she was lying or attempting some kind of elaborate scam. But he'd simply believed her, and now he was asking her to prove what she'd written. Maya nodded and gestured for him to follow her. She was aware of Marco and the other security man falling into step behind them, creating a small procession as they moved through the garage. The overhead lights seemed harsher now, the shadows deeper, and Maya's heightened awareness made every sound seem amplified. The scuff of expensive shoes on concrete, the distant hum of the ventilation system, the elevator's mechanical whir as someone else entered the garage above them. They descended the stairs in silence. Maya led them to Bay 47, where the Maserati waited, beautiful and lethal. She approached the driver's side and crouched down, pointing to the damaged brake line without touching it. The tall man crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive, cedar and bergamot. He examined the cut carefully, his face inches from hers, and Maya found herself studying his profile. He had the kind of features that belonged in Renaissance paintings, all strong lines and dramatic angles. But there was a hardness to him that suggested violence lived somewhere beneath the civilized surface. "Marco," he said, without looking away from the brake line, "get forensics down here. I want to know who was in this garage in the last 24 hours. And find me the security footage." "Yes, sir." Marco's voice was tight with suppressed anger, and Maya heard him move away, already pulling out his phone. The tall man stood, and Maya rose with him. He was studying her now with that focused intensity she'd noticed earlier, and she forced herself not to fidget under his scrutiny. "What's your name?" he asked. "Orne." Maya pulled out her notepad again and wrote, "Maya Chen." He read it, then looked at her with something that might have been comprehension. "You can't speak?" She shook her head. It was easier than explaining that she could speak, technically, but that the words had stopped coming 6 months ago, around the time she'd finally filed for divorce and discovered that David had been tracking her phone, her email, her every movement. The selective mutism had started as stress-induced paralysis and had gradually become something closer to a choice. Words had been used against her for so long that silence felt safer, more controllable. "But you can hear me," the tall man pressed. Maya nodded. "Good." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card case, extracting a business card that he held out to her. "My name is Alessandro Moretti. You just saved my life, Miss Chen. I don't forget debts like that." Maya took the card reluctantly. It was heavy, expensive, with embossed lettering that read, "Alessandro Moretti, Private Investments." Phone number, nothing else. The kind of card that said money and discretion in equal measure. She looked up at him, questions she couldn't ask, crowding her mind. Private investments. Security details. Someone trying to kill him with sabotaged brake lines. The pieces assembled themselves into a picture she recognized from movies and news reports, though she'd never encountered it directly in her own carefully circumscribed life. Alessandro Moretti was connected to organized crime. He had to be. And she'd just inserted herself directly into whatever web of violence and retribution had led to someone trying to murder him in a hotel parking garage. "I'll need to speak with you again," Alessandro said, as if he'd read her thoughts and understood her sudden urge to back away, to retreat into invisibility. "Marco will arrange protection for you until we determine who's responsible for this." Protection. The word lodged in Maya's chest like a stone. She didn't want protection. She didn't want to be noticed. She wanted to finish her shift, pick up Lily from her friend's apartment where she'd been having a sleepover, and pretend this night had never happened. Maya shook her head firmly and wrote on her notepad, "Not necessary. I'm just doing my job." Alessandro read the note, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Your job is retrieving cars, Miss Chen, not conducting vehicle safety inspections that prevent assassinations. This is beyond the scope of normal valet service." Maya wrote again, her pen pressing harder against the paper. "I don't want any trouble. Please just forget this happened." "I can't do that." Alessandro's voice was gentle but implacable. "Someone tried to kill me tonight. That same someone now knows that their attempt failed, which means they'll try again. And when they investigate why their carefully planned murder didn't work, they'll discover that a valet named Maya Chen found the tampering and warned me. At that point, Miss Chen, you become a loose end, and people in my world don't leave loose ends dangling. The cold logic of his words settled over Maya like ice water. Of course her attempt to help would backfire, would drag her into exactly the kind of danger she'd been trying to escape. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. She looked down at the business card still in her hand, at the name embossed in black on ivory cardstock. Alessandro Moretti. She'd tried to save his life, and in doing so, she'd apparently made herself a target. I know you're frightened, Alessandro said quietly. I can see it. But I promise you this. I protect what's mine. And right now, whether you like it or not, you're under my protection. Marco will follow you home tonight. He'll make sure you arrive safely. Tomorrow, we'll discuss more permanent security arrangements. Maya's hands were shaking as she wrote, I have a daughter. She's 8. Please, don't bring your world into our lives. She watched Alessandro's face as he read the words. Something shifted in his expression. A softening around his eyes. A tightness in his jaw that suggested her plea had landed somewhere behind his carefully maintained facade. Then we'll make sure your daughter stays safe too, he said simply. Give Marco your address. He'll be discreet. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who was accustomed to having his decisions implemented without argument. Maya wanted to refuse. She wanted to insist that she could handle this herself, that she and Lily didn't need protection from a man whose own brake lines had been sabotaged by his enemies. But she was also smart enough to recognize when she had no real choice. Alessandro Moretti had already decided that she was now part of his world, whether she wanted to be or not. Fighting that decision would only make things worse. Maya nodded slowly, acknowledging defeat, and saw something that might have been approval flicker across Alessandro's face. Good, he said. Now. Let's get you back upstairs. Marco will handle things here. The apartment Maya shared with Lily was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian in the Mission District, accessible by a narrow staircase that smelled like old wood, and the curry their downstairs neighbor cooked every Sunday. It was small, one bedroom that Maya had given to Lily, and a living room where Maya slept on a pull-out couch. But it was clean and quiet, and the landlord hadn't asked for references or proof of previous rental history. Maya paid in cash, 3 months at a time, and in return, Mrs. Rodriguez left them alone. Marco had followed her home as promised, his black SUV maintaining a careful distance behind her Honda. Maya had watched him in her rear-view mirror, this stranger who now knew where she lived, and felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in. David had always known where she was. He'd tracked her movements, shown up at her job, at her mother's house, at the grocery store. She'd thought that distance, 2,000 miles between Chicago and San Francisco, would be enough. But now she had a different kind of surveillance. Motivated by protection rather than control, but surveillance nonetheless. She'd picked up Lily from the Johnsons' apartment on the 2nd floor, waving goodbye to Mrs. Johnson and 8-year-old Emma, who was Lily's best friend in their new city. Lily had been tired, full of stories about the movie they'd watched and the pillow fort they'd built, and she'd barely noticed Marco's SUV parked across the street as they'd climbed the stairs to their own apartment. Now, with Lily asleep in the bedroom and the early morning light beginning to filter through the thin curtains, Maya sat on her pull-out couch and stared at Alessandro Moretti's business card. She should throw it away. She should pretend tonight had never happened, show up for her next shift at the Corinthian, and hope that whatever protection Alessandro had promised would be invisible enough that she could maintain the careful anonymity she'd built over the past 3 months. But Maya had never been particularly good at lying to herself. She knew that her life had just changed in some fundamental way, that the moment she'd handed Alessandro that note, she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, a cheap prepaid cell that she'd bought at a convenience store when she'd first arrived in San Francisco. Maya picked it up, frowning. The only people who had this number were Rita at work, Mrs. Johnson downstairs, and Lily's school. The text was from an unknown number. This is Marco. Mr. Moretti wanted me to confirm you arrived home safely. I'll be outside until the day shift arrives at 6 a.m. Maya stared at the message, a complicated tangle of emotions knotting in her chest. Gratitude. Because someone was looking out for her safety in a way that felt genuine rather than controlling. Resentment, because she'd worked so hard to be independent, and now she was dependent on the protection of a man she'd met for all of 5 minutes. Fear, because she had no idea what came next, what being under Alessandro Moretti's protection actually meant in practical terms. She typed out a response. "Thank you, of us." Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "How long will this last?" Marco's response came quickly. "As long as necessary." "Mr. Moretti takes security seriously. Someone will brief you tomorrow about the arrangements." Arrangements? Maya closed her eyes, resting her head against the back of the couch. She'd run from Chicago to escape one kind of control, one kind of cage, and now she'd apparently run straight into a different kind of trap, one decorated with good intentions and genuine danger. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't quite fair. Alessandro hadn't threatened her. He hadn't tried to intimidate her or force her into anything beyond accepting protection that, logically, she probably needed. He'd simply stated facts and made decisions based on those facts. Someone had tried to kill him. That same someone might come after her. Well, Alessandro was making sure that didn't happen. It should have felt oppressive. Instead, inexplicably, it felt almost like relief. Maya opened her eyes and looked around the small living room that had become her home. Lily's drawings covered most of one wall. Crayon pictures of flowers and houses, and a family that consisted of just the two of them. Mother and daughter, nobody else. The furniture was second-hand, bought from a thrift store during their first week in the city. The dishes in the kitchen were mismatched, collected from dollar stores and garage sales. Everything they owned could fit in her Honda with room to spare. It wasn't much, but it was hers, built from nothing after she'd walked away from a marriage that had slowly been suffocating her. And now Alessandro Moretti had inserted himself into her carefully constructed new life, bringing with him the weight of his world. A world of wealth and violence, of power and danger, of protection that came with strings she couldn't yet see. Maya picked up the business card again, running her thumb over the embossed lettering. Alessandro Moretti. She wondered what kind of man he really was, beneath the expensive suits and the commanding presence. She wondered what kind of enemies he'd made, that someone would go to the trouble of sabotaging his car with such precision and planning. She wondered if he had a family, people who depended on him, people who would grieve if the brake line sabotage had succeeded. She wondered why she cared. The sky outside was lightening, gray pre-dawn giving way to the pale gold of early morning. Maya folded the business card carefully and tucked it into her wallet, next to the emergency cash she kept hidden and the single photo she had of herself and Lily from 2 years ago, before everything had fallen apart. Today, really, she would deal with whatever arrangements Alessandro and his people had planned. She would figure out how to maintain her boundaries while accepting protection she couldn't refuse. She would keep Lily safe, keep their life as normal as possible, and hope that this situation would resolve itself quickly. But for now, she needed to sleep. She needed to close her eyes and rest, even though her mind was racing with questions and scenarios, and the memory of Alessandro Moretti's dark eyes studying her with that unsettling intensity. Maya pulled a blanket over herself, curled on her side on the pull-out couch, and listened to the sounds of her daughter's steady breathing from the bedroom, the distant hum of traffic on Mission Street, and the knowledge that outside, a man named Marco sat in his SUV, watching over them. For the first time since she'd fled Chicago, Maya didn't feel quite so alone.